Thank you all for being here. Thanks especially to our panelists. We have a lot of expertise on this topic in our own building, so we're all really looking forward to hearing from you. We'll go over three kind of general areas, one around prevention, what can we do to prevent these things from happening, how to support folks and ourselves now in the process while we're in it in our community, and then discuss a little bit about how the social justice implications that run through gun violence and these issues. So if you have questions, we definitely want this to be conversational. There's a lot of us and there's a lot of panelists. So if you can add any questions in the chat, feel free to make that a dynamic conversation among all of us. David's going to be monitoring that chat box, and kind of at the end of each section, or just, when it makes sense, he'll interject a summary of your comments and questions for the panelists from the chat. Okay, and Carl's going to kick us off with a little bit of context setting and some opening remarks.
Well, thank you everybody for joining, and I'm just looking, we're up to 31 people, which was really good. And you almost all have your videos on, which I can't get my students to do. It's like I've got 35 people in class and only about 12 of them turn their videos on. But anyway, no, I'm sorry, Rick, you can, I didn't mean to nag. So, this is part of, so we've dedicated the social justice speaker series for our program, this monthly series, and we decided to do every other month would be a single speaker versus more of a more relaxed format. And today is more of a relaxed format. Given the mass shootings that we experienced this last month, we thought this would be an appropriate topic for us to address this in this meeting. Can you see my screen? Yeah. And a number of people came forward and volunteered to be part of a panel discussion around community violence and what could we do about it. So I want to thank them for doing that. Sabrina Arredondo Matson, Monica Fitzgerald, Sarah Goodrum, Jessica Garano, Beverly Kingston, and Bill Woodward here in alphabetical order. So I hope you're on the call as well. I think I saw everybody. So what I'm going to do, I timed this at 5 minutes, is for those who don't know as much of this area, is to provide a little bit of context around the topic. I hear some audio. I don't know whose audio it is. Does someone have their mic on? Maybe it's just me hearing it. Oh, it went away. So, okay, good. That's great. All right. Well, let me give a little bit of context for the discussion, where we were at. And if we're starting with not even a month ago, the mass shooting in Atlanta, where 8 people were shot, largely Asian. And then not even a week later here in Boulder, where 10 people were shot and killed, including an officer, and many of whom were known to people in the community. I knew the officer who was killed. We went to the same high school, and other people knew some of the other victims of the shooting as well. And it seemed that at that time, during COVID, supermarkets has been like the one safe place you could go, and it violated that safety even if you didn't know the victims of the shooting. And the worst part about talking about today's shooting is we have to use the word this month's shooting, is we have to use that word, this month's shooting. When you look at it, Beverly and her team just completed a retrospective in recognition of the 20th year anniversary of the Columbine shooting last spring. And so a lot of the headlines are eerily familiar that we see now, that we've been seeing for 20 years. In fact, in Colorado, we've had our share of mass shootings over the last several years. When you think about it, we're not alone. There was the Orlando nightclub shooting in 2016, which at that point, in June of 2016, was the worst mass shooting in US history. And then in Las Vegas, a year later, that was superseded by the Las Vegas shooting, where 59 people were killed and 850 people were wounded. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland followed after that. And then just looking more broadly, this is the number of gun violence deaths just since the year started. This is just since January 1st in America. And we have had 11,300 gun violence deaths since January. Most of those are suicide. 6,400 were suicide and 4,900 were homicide. 131 were mass shootings, 9 of those mass murders, 74 children killed, and 278 teenagers. And that's just since January. When you look at last year, 43,000 people were killed in America by gun violence deaths, 24,000 of those suicide. And you look at it over time on the left, if it feels like it's increasing, it is. The numbers have been increasing over time. This is the total number of gun violence deaths in 2019. So it's not equally distributed across the United States. It tends to be concentrated in the Southeast and coastal states. For some context, when you think about that, 43,000 deaths, well, there are 328 million people in America. That means that the chances of dying from gun violence are about 13 in 100,000, your probability of dying from gun violence in America. That puts it in the top 10, right at about 8 or 9. So the chances of dying in America are around number 8 or 9 in the top 10. And just for context also, COVID is number 3 right now. So mass shootings, gun violence deaths aside, these are mass shootings since 2009. And since 2009, there have been 246 mass shootings, which are usually identified as 4 or more people killed, not including the shooter at a single event. 1,400 people shot and 950 shot and killed, and 950 shot and wounded. What's interesting, when you look at mass shootings, 61% of mass shootings occurred entirely in the home. There's this perception that it's this very public thing, like movie theaters and churches. But 61% of the mass shootings are entirely at home, with another 10% at home and in public combined. 54% of the mass shootings, the shooter exhibited warning signs before the shooting. And that's one of the things I'm thinking our panel might talk about warning signs. In another 54%, the mass shootings were domestic violence related. If you feel that they've been increasing, they have been over time. In number, but more than in number, in the number of people killed per event has increased over time. part of the conversation that you've been seeing, and I don't know if we're going to talk about this today or not, I'll hear from our panelists, is the issue of assault rifles or other high capacity weapons that are similar to assault rifles, high capacity rapid fire weapons, and whether those are part of the problem. Well, and in fact, in 1994, President Clinton signed an assault weapons ban that then expired in 2004 under pressure from the NRA. And then it was not renewed. So when you look at the data, this is before, during the ban, and after, that the number of gun violence of mass shootings did seem to decline during the period of the assault rifle ban. But that's not the whole story. Although mass shootings are increasing, it's still more common that people are killed by handguns. It is increasing for both assault rifles and for mass shootings as a whole, but handguns dominate the death rate. 81% of mass shootings involved a handgun. 17% of mass shootings involved an assault weapon, and 59% involved a high capacity magazine. But what's interesting, even though the majority of mass shootings involved a handgun, if an assault rifle was used, it 6 times more people were shot. And if it was a high capacity magazine, then 5 times more people were shot. So they're used less often, but they result in more injuries and fatalities when they are used. This is the United States. Currently, we have more guns than people in the US. For every 100 people in the US, we have 120 guns. And you think, well, how does that compare to the rest of the world? Well, here's the rest of the world. So we are awash with guns in America. And similarly, when you look at mass shootings on the y-axis and the number of guns on the x, you can see here's the United States. We're way out here in terms of the number of mass shootings and the number of guns we have in America. And then here's the rest of the world. Is down at the origin. So I just have like 3 more slides. We like to think Beverly used this slide in a talk earlier this month, is that we think of mass shootings as the tip of the iceberg, the thing that you see that gets the headlines. So that's what people recognize, and they have risen in the last 40 years. But there's this broader spectrum of community violence, of aggression and bullying in schools and families and communities that, in my view, in a sense, provides a backdrop for these events that make headlines. So these are firearm deaths and firearm injuries over the last few years. And what you can see is there's a constant noise ongoing of firearm deaths and firearm injuries. And then there are these events that rise above the noise that get the headlines. So we have the methods of preventing that background noise, the community violence, but we aren't implementing it. I get frustrated because if you keep doing what you've always done, you're going to keep getting what you've always gotten. We're not addressing this problem. We need to do something different than what we've been doing. The message that we continue to give is you need to address the root causes of community violence. That's my mantra. I've given this example before. If you are like, oh, this might be too loud. If you have popcorn going. You could try to decide which one is going to pop next and identify that one and pull it out. And that's an important thing to do. And that's what you try to do in identifying and reporting warning signs. So if you do have warning signs of people who are going to commit a mass shooting, that we need to know that. On the other hand, you could also turn down the heat and make it less likely that any one individual is going to engage in violence. So for me, the universal, it's a combination of these more selective strategies, identifying people at risk, as well as coupled with more universal violence prevention. So the questions that we had for the group to talk about are prevention, what can we do? How can we respond and support people now? And how is this related to our discussion on social justice issues in America? Okay. So that's it. That's my intro.
Thanks, Carl. We'll start. I'm going to start directing with this first question to Beverly because I know she has a few slides. But given that we're a prevention program or in an institute that works in this area, we know a decent amount about this. I'd say above the general population probably. But at the same time, we'd love to hear what you would want to remind us about what we can do, what we should be advocating for as researchers and folks working in an institute in this area about what we can do to prevent violence and prevent mass shootings and gun violence.
Thanks, Katie.
Beverly, if you'd like to go for it.
Okay, so Carl did cover some of my slides, so really I'm only going to need to do a couple. And if you yeah, maybe just in a minute you can pull them up. I was kind of hoping that you would pull them up for me because I have too many things open on my computer.
Gotcha. I'm
okay.
got it.
Yeah, and yeah, we can just go to the let's just go to the third slide. Yeah, thank you. And then I do want to just kind of start with just reminding everyone, this is something that I say often, is that both of these actually came from Don Quick, who was the district attorney when I worked in Adams County, and he's now the chief judge in the 17th Judicial District. But he served on the Columbine Review Commission. He worked closely with Dell, and he would say two things about prevention. And so I kind of want to just remind us about these two things. The first was what he heard most often from crime victims was that they wished that their crime could have been prevented, that it never would have happened. And then the second is that he would talk about how prevention makes sense with an S, like it's very sensible. You'll see as from the things I'm talking about and what Carl said in the introduction. And also it makes sense with the C in terms of dollars and cents. I've just been asked by the media to make some comparisons between this prevention of violence and COVID, and you can see, all what we didn't do and how expensive it is to, like I can't even think about how expensive the numbers are. So mind-blowing to have not prevented COVID. We could have done so much more, and now we're just spending it's in like the trillions of dollars. And I think the same thing about violence. If you add up all the costs, I know that the costs are in the trillions. They're in the trillions for, economic, but there's a huge impact of violence on individuals and communities as, on your life potential. And it doesn't mean, like we'll probably hear from Monica's team, that we can't be resilient and overcome the things that have happened, but it is much better to not have to deal with that and to prevent it from happening in the first place. And there's multiple reasons for that, which we're not going to be able to get into in this presentation. But I want to say a couple more things before I kind of get into the comprehensive approach. One is that I think there's a real urgency to us getting this message of prevention out right now. For those of us who have been working in violence prevention for a long time, and, Sarah, Bill, several of us have national colleagues that are in law enforcement in different sectors, but we're all very concerned about violence increasing in regards to the social stressors that are happening in our society. And, we know some of them right now around, what's happened with the civil unrest, with COVID. You can even look at what happened like with the power outages in Houston. I think more and more is going to happen around climate change. So this is a really pressing issue, social issue, that IBS, we focus on pressing social issues. And it's one where the real solutions don't usually get talked about. And we tend to end up with this guns or no guns circular conversation that doesn't get to the root causes. It doesn't mean that conversation is not important. It just doesn't get to the root causes. So just want to give you that context. And then the other part of the thing that Carl said at the intro is that, there really, really is good news. And this is how, I did cry in some of my talks with the media this week or last week or whatever, especially when they asked me, like, how am I doing with all this? I just start to cry because I'm like, this is our community. We all had people touched in some way, some closer than others, or by it happening there. And so I did have to do, and I am still doing that kind of grieving, but I also am very hopeful because we do know so much about what works to prevent violence. That's why Dell started the center in 1992, because he did not want to keep this a secret. He wanted to see that what works gets into the hands of the people who need it. And he spent his whole career talking and saying the same things over and over again to the media and trying to change policy and trying to get this out. And he's taught me those, same messages. And I pretty much saying the same things that he said, maybe a little bit of a different twist, but it's not that different. So we'll say those things again, and hopefully, that it will be helpful for all of you to hear. And I love the idea of us coming together collectively to see how we can be more powerful in getting this message out. So I'm very happy to quickly share these with you. And then I want to turn it over to let other people get a chance to kind of weigh in on some of those other prevention questions. So as what we know is we need to be using a comprehensive approach to preventing violence. Oh, can you keep it on the first slide, Katie?
I'm sorry.
And a comprehensive approach, just like Carl said, it provides upstream prevention and intervention. And if you want to just go back a second to the slide right before that, this slide just gives you sort of a sense of what we mean by, intervention and prevention. And, some of you may have heard me say this before, that intervention basically waits until the child's fallen into the water and throws them a life preserver, which is good, still good to get thrown that life preserver when you're exhibiting red flags and warning signs and, you're hurting. We want to get help to the people that need help. But we also have amazing programs and strategies around prevention, and prevention basically equips kids and adults and gives them the tools they need. It allows them to put on a life vest, if they fall into the water, but we can even, do more than that. And that's what I think like the most upstream prevention is about. And that's where we're teaching our children how to swim. And, here's where I always say, I'll talk about the evidence-based programs that can be put into place throughout the life course, like nurse-family partnership, Incredible Years, paths, the different social emotional learning programs that are effective, life skills in middle school, the dating violence program, I forget, Safe Dates, it's in high school. The Blueprints has a whole list of programs that could be put into place throughout the life course that affect multiple social contexts, the individual, the peers, family, schools. So that's really, really important. But the thing with that is, it's like we don't typically have the resources, the capacity to pay for those programs or the implementation supports to ensure that they're implemented well. We don't have an infrastructure to support prevention. And that really needs to be part of our public safety strategy. So if you can go back, Katie, now to the next slide. And so the second, one more back. Okay, and then the second bullet is that it, as Carl said, we need to make sure we're identifying and addressing the warning signs through bystander reporting and response, like safe to tell kinds of systems, threat assessment and management, along with information sharing and mental and behavioral health supports, as well as, that's where I think the safe storage practices can fit in there as well. And then within all that, you need to make sure that there's a positive culture and climate that's the foundation of all the prevention work. So now you can go to the next slide. So here it's kind of a repeat of those different components. And I really think that we need to do a little bit, we need to have on the slide, I'm not sure where it's going to go yet, but having, the safe storage practices, safe gun storage, and also, ensuring that weapons don't get into the hands of someone who should not have a gun. So our prevention strategies and earlier intervention strategies are really aimed at removing the motivation for someone to want a weapon for criminal reasons. That's what we aim to do. So it goes deeper than only thinking about gun violence. We want to stop someone from ever wanting that weapon. But we also know that we're not going to, there's a lot of stuff going on in society right now. And at the same time, we need to prevent someone from getting a weapon into their hands that wants to do harm. And so there's policies. We definitely know that safe storage practices are effective. There's more that we can do as well with studying. And so you can just see in this circle are some of those key components. I'm not going to go into detail on that. And then, yeah, so I don't think we have to cover that last slide. Well, we can real quick, because I did like to have I do like to always give that plug for blueprints, but Carl did cover, this idea that we do know we could reduce violence by 30% if we were to put into place what works. And that number is a number that I ran by Dell, and we came to it based on the effect sizes of the blueprint programs. And so if we really could scale what we know works, we could be doing so much better of reducing violence and, of course, other problem behaviors, because all these things are correlated. We also would have a society where we increase pro-social behaviors as well. So I'll just end with saying, there's not a quick fix. There's not a magic formula. We find that prevention gets left out of the conversation because it's maybe because it's too complex, or I don't know, too much money, lots of reasons. I know I just keep saying the same thing over and over again. I have ever since I started talking to the media after Sandy Hook. And I think we can do a better job of really getting this prevention message out and providing clear guidelines about what schools, communities, parents, what we all could be doing to prevent violence. There's a lot of studies that all show the same things, but in similar things to what Carl showed us at the beginning, but there's not clear direction for people of what they exactly should do from those. Like there's a study from the feds that just came out last year that has 640 recommendations, or 639, something like that. And so, how do you make sense of that? And so as a scientific community, I think we can help make sense of that. And the other thing that I also like to end with is to say that when we think about climate, we all create climate in every single interaction. Like we're creating it together right now, of us coming together and saying, like, how do we want to gather? How do we want to be together? And some of the things you can no matter what do are, pay deep attention to what's going on in your environment, but pay deep attention to your relationships with people close to you, the deep listening, the loving speech, the things you need to take care of yourselves and each other. And I know Monica's team will talk about that more. So, so anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now and just the rest of my team to just talk briefly about the rest of the questions.
Yeah, Bill, Sarah, Sabrina, specifically around this prevention. I know you all have so much experience here. So.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we're often struggling to try to figure out is where are the gaps? Why have we not made more progress in preventing these kinds of mass attacks? And I would say that, you know, we've done a really good job of preventing these kinds of violent attacks in school settings. We've improved bystander reporting with the Safe to Tell program, particularly in Colorado, but those types of anonymous reporting programs are being used in other states across the country. We've also made a really good progress with threat assessment and management and the use of those tools to evaluate students who are showing some troubling signs of the potential for violence. I think the big challenge now is how do we take what we've learned about how to prevent violence in school settings and translate it to community settings. And I think that's going to take, you know, a couple of things. One, improving people's awareness of what the warning signs are, depressive symptoms, aggressive, intense anger, an interest in violence, but also lowering the threshold for when people identify and report those concerns, so that we're not to the point where a person's acquired a weapon and is then going to move to perpetrate some sort of mass attack. But there's also confusion about once you see that information, where do you report it? Do you report it to the police? Do you report it to a mental health provider? In school settings, that place to report is Safe to Tell. And what we could be trying to figure out is getting a clearer message out to communities, the public, about where you take that information and what you do with it. How do you follow up? How do you ensure that appropriate actions been taken? In the case at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, the attacker in that case had 21 encounters with local police. And he had 55 instances where he had disciplinary action taken against him in the school setting. So he was certainly on their radar. He was certainly, people were aware that there were problems. But I think what the next step is in building the systems in communities that figure out how to work with people who are falling below a situation where there's criminal action that can be taken, but that are engaging in some troubling behavior. There's just a big gap there. In all the documented cases with the Parkland situation, you know, they couldn't arrest him. There was no criminal violation there that called for an arrest, but certainly there were cries for help. So I think, you know, awareness, clarity about how to report that concern, and then what do we do with those kind of gray areas or middle ground for providing interventions, particularly for people who are out of school settings. Sabrina or Bill?
I can touch on gun violence questions specifically, but my internet is a little sketchy. So tell me if I'm freezing or something's going on. So as indicated by some of the questions posed, for more than 20 years, research on gun violence has lagged behind due to the Dickey Amendment, which prohibits federal funds to advocate or promote gun control, and it's limited NIH and CDC funding for gun violence research. And while the Dickey Amendment has not gone away, in 2018, a report accompanying the spending bill clarifies that the amendment does not prohibit federal funding of research on the causes of gun violence. So, in line with what Beverly has said, the risk factors for gun violence are very similar to the risk factors for violence in general. And although there are nuances to prevention, such as what Beverly talked about as well, safe storage practices. And so this limited funding for gun violence research has also limited evidence-based programs and strategies that are more specific to gun violence. Although there is some evidence for abandoned building, vacant lot remediation, street outreach approaches such as cure violence and safe streets. But there's much more work to be done that's specific to gun violence. When it comes to background checks, and I have to tell you, policy is not my expertise, but I did get a chance to do a quick review of some of these policies, and I'm happy to update and provide a more formal lit review later. But so as Carl said, the Brady Handgun Violence Act of 1994 required background checks on those who wanted to buy a gun. Unfortunately, most gun crimes are committed with weapons that are not purchased from dealers, but from illegal sales or off the books transactions, the illegal gun market. And so while the Brady Act blocked over 2 million sales between 1994 and 2010, the evaluation of the Brady Act by Ledwick and Cook showed no evidence of a reduction in the homicide rate or suicide rate that could be attributed to the Brady Act. And that's just one study. So as I said, I need to do a more exhaustive lit review. I also need to look into research on permit to purchase laws. There appears to be some promising results there. Permit to purchase laws are require that individuals apply to local law enforcement agencies and are allowed, and law enforcement agencies are allowed 30 days, an average of 30 days to complete a more thorough background check, which is compared to the usual 3 days. That thorough and extended time to conduct a background check may reduce impulsive acts where a firearm may be purchased to harm oneself or others. The assault weapon ban has shown mixed results. Apparently, the ban did not appear to affect gun crime during the time it was in effect, but some evidence suggests that it may have modestly reduced gunshot victims had it remained in place for a longer period of time. And the ban's most important component was probably its prohibition on ammunition magazines holding more than 10 rounds. More recently, the red flag gun laws have been put into place. As of 2020, 19 states and the District of Columbia have enacted red flag laws. They're also known as extreme risk protection orders. And most research on these laws are still in development. The most recent research I saw have only done descriptive studies on the cases that have been on the ERPOs. Although there is one study on in Indiana and Connecticut that have found ERPOs to be effective at reducing firearm suicides. But I suspect more research on this will be coming out soon. And I just want to emphasize, as Beverly emphasized, the importance of safe storage practices. It's just a crucial element of responsible gun ownership to reduce gun violence. It helps to ensure that guns are not used in an inappropriate manner or by unauthorized users. The current estimates find that less than half of gun owners engage in safe storage practices for their guns. I will turn it over to Bill now to add anything.
Okay. Is that working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'll just add a little more to that part of the discussion, because I think the important thing for me at this point, everybody has covered the major points here, but I really want to get to the point of when things get reported, what happens to them. In other words, we had, as Beverly mentioned and Sarah mentioned, actually, that when Parkland, when he was reported, I think he had 69 contacts with the police. They basically didn't know what to do with him. And that was also true in Virginia Tech. It was also true in our case where our offender, we did the Arapahoe High School shooting study, Sarah and I did. And we really found that these reports go into sort of a giant black hole. And so while the reporting is really important and we want to make it more convenient and make it easier even for families to report, I think what was found in the Innocence Project that looked at better than that was done in 2000, but found 190, there were 53 defendants who, it turned out, were imprisoned for 197 years because of mistaken eyewitness testimony. And that's basically what we now understand, is that there's a sense of latent defects in the criminal justice system, in the mental health systems, and in domestic violence systems. In most systems, there are latent defects which allow all of these kinds of accidents to occur, because seemingly minor errors can cause major tragedies. Minor errors in surgery can cause surgeons to cut off the wrong leg. Minor errors in convictions and the way convictions are obtained causes people to have to spend a lot of time in jail and prison, which moves more into our social justice issue area. And so what we find is that you have to build this climate, this safe school climate or safe community climate and safe organizational climate, so that these errors get reported. Because when they're not reported, and then we don't build the capacity to respond to them, we're in real trouble. So for example, in terms of shooters, why is it that the shooter in Boulder why didn't that get reported by the family? Well, one, I think it's very difficult for families to own up to problems of their family members. And how do we make that easier for people? We've made it easier for people to report domestic violence by putting family resource centers into local shopping malls, so that a person who says they're going shopping can actually drop into a family resource center and ask for help from someone there. Well, I think we have to do the same kinds of things so that families who have mental health problems can drop into some place that it doesn't connote that they're telling, and get help for that family. So what we do know is that there are different types of shooters, and depending on the type of shooter, I think we have to build different prevention strategies. Not going to talk about that here, but there should be different prevention strategies. Bottom line message, though, is that none of those prevention strategies are going to work without proper leadership. Organizational leadership around allowing people to report their own errors, such in pilots flying airplanes or in surgeons making mistakes in surgery. People have to feel free to report their own errors. You only feel free to report your own error if you're in a climate of trust, and that the organizational culture builds a climate of trust, that you feel confident that you can report things and get help without getting in trouble. That's kind of my bottom line. Thanks, and I'll turn this over to
Thanks,
who's
Phil.
next.
I think given the time, we're running a little tight, but we'd love to hear from Monica and Jessica on that area of how to respond now. You know, this is in our community affected, you know, our friends and our family in our neighborhood grocery store. We don't have a ton of time, but if you can touch on just your highlights of how can we best support one another, thoughts on what we say to children or youth, and just particularly powerful ways you've seen families be resilient in these settings.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, well, I think we first really send the message around taking care of yourself. And I think Beverly nodded to this, of like this awareness building of how we're doing. to be able to be present and more effective, actually understanding the needs of others, those more, and so I think that tuning in, because knowing that this kind of event and that many other types of violent events can really kind of bring up previous events or previous traumas or situations that relate to your own experiences or related to your identities. And so there's that intersection and that importance of saying, okay, how am I doing? Because if, especially in the context of this chronic stress right now with these shootings, with the COVID and social isolation, and really making room to acknowledge that and understand and normalize. I understand this, building space for cultivating your own well-being so that you really can not be reacting from a place of your own, maybe hurt or areas that you need your own supports around. And then I would just say to meet people where they are. And that's the idea, is how can I be present and grounded to meet people where they are, and including yourself, as I was saying, but not assuming you know what people need. I think this is really important, is that what you need might be very different. And so you're leaving the room for a range of responses, coping time, because sometimes there's a delay in time of where people want to get support or help or talk about it. And so that one size does not fit all. And that importance, which Beverly touched on, about being present, open, and curious, and talking about it. And so sometimes people are saying, like, what do I say? And I'll maybe leave that for Jess to comment on a little more specifically, because we've been developing some resources, building off other resources out there. How do you talk about this with youth, young children, school-age children, and then teenagers, and then also to the college community, really affected here, but it's very generalizable, not just in this Boulder mass shooting situation, but with all of this, the other violence we've been talking about, in school violence. So I would just say we have to remember that resilience, yes, we want to prevent, it's prevention, and then also knowing that some of the major resilience factors that are working. And so that belonging and connection is, and a supportive community, which I think everyone is touching on here, is one of the most powerful resilience factors, 25 years of research. So, and tapping in, is it family, friends, communities, your routines, rituals, keeping those, the spiritual or traditions or meaningful ways that you might, kind of ground and process. And so I think I'm going to just pass over to Jess, if Jess sounds good, to talk maybe a little bit more about that. Anything you want to build off what I've just said? I know we had a few other points, but I'm just trying to summarize briefly. And also
sure.
ways to talk about it.
Yeah, and also keep this super brief, but I think the biggest point is talk about it, right? It's to extend that we just heard about culture and climate, and make sure that you are creating space that says, here we name and talk about challenging things, difficult things, scary things. We talk about our feelings, our perspectives, our thoughts, right? That's especially important for children, but for us as well, right? We have a lot of unwritten social rules about what we can talk about and how we can talk about those things. And these might be coming up for us right now too. So to acknowledge those things and make sure that you are, first, always checking in with yourself, and then thinking about, all right, so what's my goal for this? So I have a almost 8-year-old son, and I'm a solo parent, and so this happened, and I worked all day on these kinds of things, and he came home, and I was super, I was just drained, dead to the world, and I didn't mention it, right? And I'm here talking to you all about this, right? I didn't mention it. And then he was going to bed, and one of the things we say is, I'm like, okay, Joe, shine your light, which means send good energy, talk to spirit, do what you do. And he turned around and he goes, I'll pray for the dead. And I knew at that moment, girl, you have missed the boat. I forgot to talk about it with him. So he needed to have that opening and then come downstairs and talk about it. He also said, I couldn't mention it at school because my teacher didn't say anything and I didn't want to scare anyone. So we have to be super intentional about opening that door And maybe it's only open for a little bit, right? But then you open it again and you keep opening it because this is an ongoing process, right? We don't talk about it once and then it's over. This process continues. Are there other things, Monica, you want to mention?
I was just going to say we child size it. So to that, the information that is appropriate for the developmental level. So talking about it with Jessica's son is going to be really different than how I talk about it with my teenage kids. And I think when we were talking about opening the door and not assuming that they know what you know either. Learn. So your goal is to learn their experience, how they're feeling about it, their range of feelings. They might have different ones than you have. And so that noticing and just reflecting what you hear, using their words, not your big words, taking it slow. So meaning don't rush. You're communicating, I have time for you. Asking helpful questions, but not fact-finding questions, asking questions of, does that feel, what was that like for you? What, how is that for your friends? Questions that are going to help you, learn about that. Well, at school, we're doing this or that. You're going to learn a lot if you have open-ended questions, reflect, and then validate. Validate away, normalize. That makes sense. I understand. And just know too, in bits of like Jess said, you might bring it up and you don't have to have a big long conversation, coming back and having many touch-ins around it. Being okay with silence. But when you're helping young people and all people, honestly, identify their feelings and label their feelings, we know even just labeling feelings helps us to come closer to a place of calm and grounding. And helps us to activate then that problem solving and action. And there's sometimes where, what we said, meeting people where they need, sometimes young people and adults around you are going to say, I want to do something, I want to act. And that's something that can be really empowering and feel like I want some, agency, efficacy here. So matching them, but also not pushing them, or even to engage in rituals or in actions that you might find like, have you been to the memorial? Have you done this? X, Y, and Z. And I think that's really important. We're having a lot of conversations with teachers too, working with students, having these conversations. So we'll put the little link, maybe Jess, you can put the link to our most updated resources and
Actually already there.
Thank you, the Spanish versions, but just kind of showing presence and openness. And then once we recognize what people around us do need, then it's about us being able to not know everything, but to be able to link to that level of support they might need, or you might need yourself if you are noticing that your functioning is really affected day to day. So I'll stop there, but knowing that resilience really can be cultivated and taught, and supported. Yeah.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And I love that personal experience story. I can totally identify with that, Jessica. Carl had his hand raised. Carl?
Sorry, I didn't know when to bring it up. I want to represent Kate, who's wasn't able to come today. And we were talking with Kate yesterday about marginalized populations. And one of the things that she mentioned was one, that individuals in marginalized populations often are the target of these actions. Whether you're in a synagogue or the folks who worked in the spas in Georgia. The other is that even if you're not the target, Kate was pointing out that a lot of marginalized populations and others have experienced personal trauma in the past, and that when these events happen, there's a secondary trauma. So they re-experience their trauma again, even though this might not have been their trauma this time, they're feeling it differently than others. I hope I'm representing what Kate was bringing up yesterday as well.
You are, Carl, and that's how we need to be aware of intergenerational, historical and cultural trauma, and also how there's this intersection with identities and experience. And when we talk about that, gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ community, secondary trauma, the impact, why one person might have, or a group of people really do feel threatened their sense of security, undermining their well-being, threatened by a mass violent event. Thanks.
I think maybe one more thing I'll add to that very quickly is just that when something like this occurs, we are all in the business of trying to make meaning out of these events and answer the question of why, right? So we just talked about all we know about how to prevent these things and what we know, and yet every single person is going, why did this happen? And so that may be because someone says mental health, that may be because someone says guns. And your children might ask you also, like, why did this happen, right? And so just thinking for yourself that meaning making is also an ongoing occurrence. And so that always can shift and wax and wane and change. And for yourself as a listener and as a supporter, that's not actually about you having an answer. That's just about you needing to hold space for that. So resist the pressure that you can sometimes feel as an adult to have the answers. It's actually not about that.
Real quickly, with the couple minutes we have left, there was a question that was in the chat for Beverly. The question is, do you see an influx in community or school desires to adopt prevention programs after mass shootings occur?
A great question. Well, I guess there's the question, like, do they come to us wanting answers like right after the shooting? Is that probably what the question is? Like, because something happens, do they respond? And I wish I could say, yes, we see an influx. We don't. We definitely, I think it tends to be more of the technical solutions end up being what gets thought about first, like, oh, we need more, that we saw after Parkland, the conversation of metal detectors coming back again. And, this sort of, it recycles the same things, like maybe we need our teachers to carry guns, or, like a lot of times that's what ends up in the conversation. However, I will say, like, after the Douglas school shooting, the one that happened in Douglas County School District reached out to us, and we've really had some great conversations about this comprehensive approach. And we talked to their school board, and we actually had started a partner with them because we'd already been working with them as part of our Safe Community, Safe Schools work. And but then with COVID, that also affected like what they were going to survey all their students, and then we had COVID. So it's, there's a lot going on. And this also goes to that our schools and our systems in our society are flooded. And, I've talked about that numerous times, what that means to be flooded. Basically, it's like they don't have the capacity. Oftentimes they might really have the motivation and want to do something. I mean, I really think they do a lot of times really want change, but there's not an infrastructure to do this. Like, we have police departments, we have human services, but we don't have prevention departments. And, public health is an area that does kind of focus on that, but it's still, the infrastructure is not as strong as it needs to be. So I don't want to blame at all. I want to be really careful not to blame the systems, or because it's not that. It's much more complex than just the motivation. And so that's my answer.
Thank you so much.
Can you close us out?
Yes. Thank you, panelists, so much. I know you're incredibly busy and it's crazy times. So thanks for being with us. And as a theme came up of ongoing conversations, we jam-packed a lot into here. So hopefully we'll continue all of these conversations, hopefully have more chance to really talk about the social justice aspects of this. But just continue these conversations in your small groups and smaller teams. Thank you all for being here, and it's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to let you go.
And thanks, Katie and David, for organizing this.